All right, hey comrades, welcome to the ninth class of Liberation School's course on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital, and congratulations comrades, we've made it through the book. As you know, I'm Marisa Elise Sanchez, a PSL member in New York City, and a member of the Liberation School Editorial Collective. We have been hosting this course because, as we've talked about, capital can be a really daunting text, and we really want to present a study of it from the perspective of those committed to advancing the worldwide struggle for socialism and liberation. And in today's class, we'll be covering part 8 of the book, where Marx looks at the historical development of capitalism, or how the eternal natural laws of capitalism came to be established and continue to be expanded and reinforced. And just as a reminder, as we go through the class today, the slides do refer to 3 different versions of the text, the first being the online version, the second, the international publishers version, and the third, the Penguin version. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Comrade Derek Ford. Derek is a member of the PSL in Indianapolis, the editor of Liberation News, and just want to say, thank you so much to Derek for doing these classes. After the class, I will once again facilitate the question and answer, and congratulations again, everyone. Really appreciate being a part of this process with y'all.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks, comrades. So we're at the last class discussing part 8 of the book, and where finally Marx at the end turns to a brief historical investigation of how capitalism actually came to be. Thus far in the book, he's been more or less assuming that there's 2 classes of people. There's one class that has nothing to sell but their labor power, and because they can't produce their own necessities of life, they are forced to buy them as commodities. And then a class that owns and employs those workers and sells them those commodities. And I mean, it's interesting, there's some people actually who say that you should start reading the book here, that part 8 should be the first thing you read, just because there's a, more of a sort of historical, maybe accessible grounding before proceeding to the more abstract chapters at the beginning of the book. But, I think the downside of this is that it could potentially tie our understanding of what Marx says in Capital to this sort of particular story, which is an example of the way in which the foundations for capitalism, which Marx earlier said are not natural given, but socially produced, were produced. How the original capital was accumulated, how labor power was created, how the capitalist class was created. So, and Marx in this is primarily interested in England. And so this is a story that doesn't unfold, in the exact same way every place, although we can still see these methods of primitive accumulation at work today in the United States and really across the world. So it's important to note at the beginning that Marx isn't describing primitive accumulation, but he's critiquing it. Primitive accumulation is a term that he inherited from bourgeois political economy. Adam Smith, for example, wrote about primitive or originary accumulation. And he says that primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. So this is basically the story that, once upon a time, there were 2 kinds of people. One group were thrifty, and they were smart, and they were frugal, and they saved, and they didn't engage in, wasteful behavior. And on the other side, there were people who were stupid and lazy and wasteful. And the former became the capitalists, and the latter became the workers, or the industrial reserve army. And Marx is going to show that this is sort of a fable, right? An origin fable and that it was really notorious that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force played the great part in this history of how capital came to be. Because the capitalist system itself doesn't produce its own presuppositions, right? Being the separation of laborers from property and the means of production. The process that precedes capitalism transforms, on the one hand, the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other, the immediate producers into wage labor. So it's a process of divorcing people from the land and the means of subsistence more generally, and through which both are transformed into commodities, the people and the means of subsistence. And the next chapters, Marx is going to show us how this happens, beginning with the expropriation of the agricultural producer from the soil, which he says is the basis of the entire process. So in the next, 3 chapters, Marx is going to talk about the sort of theft of land, the ways in which peasants were driven off the land and then were disciplined into being wage laborers, and so on. So the expropriation of the agricultural production from the land. So in England, this was a result of the theft of land, which thereby forced peasants to seek work elsewhere as wage laborers. Feudal lords also conquered and then privatized land, which drove peasants away, because previously, he says, that the peasants really had the same right to the land as the feudal lord. There's a lot of reasons why this happens, but it's generally because of the subjection of capital and the transformation of capital from land to money. So one example that he gives is the rise of Flemish wool manufacture, the industrialization of wool manufacture increased the price of wool, and so it gave incentives to the feudal lords to transform land that was used for harvesting and required a lot of labor into pasture, which required less labor. At first, he says that legislation tries to halt this process, but basically the power of money and moneyed capital prevails, and the law comes instead to serve money power. This accelerates with the reformation of the church, in which, in an age when the church is being challenged as the primary authority of, knowledge and everything else, right? And so as the church was reformed, the estates and the land were to a large extent given away to royal favorites, or they were sold incredibly cheaply to speculating farmers and citizens, who then drove out the subtenants, right, and threw their holdings into one. The state also just straight up stole and gave away lands. And he talks about the enclosure of the commons, initially which were expropriated by individual acts of violence during the 15th and 16th centuries, but by the 18th century, it's happening through state legislation. So what's interesting, Marx says, is that, bourgeois political economists are all about the sacred rights of property, right? But these rights themselves were founded on the grossest acts of violence to persons, not only theft and murder, but the destruction and burning of villages, right? But after a time, the memory of this process is diminished, and it's replaced or supplemented by this story of, bourgeois primitive accumulation. So Marx, in the last paragraph, sort of summarizes this process: the spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the robbery of the common lands, the usurpation of feudal and clan property, and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of reckless terrorism, were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. In chapter 28, he deals with how the expropriated peasants were turned into wage laborers, basically, because peasantry is a different form of labor than industrial labor, and then and very different than wage labor. And on the other hand, the problem was that there were more peasants being driven off the land than there were industrial opportunities for them to be employed, right? And so the peasants were driven off the land, but the law, they treated their unemployment as voluntary, right? And so therefore treated them as criminals and assumed that it depended on their own goodwill to go on working under the old conditions that no longer existed. So Marx goes through a series of really grotesque laws aimed at disciplining the new jobless wage laborers, including whipping, enslavement, branding, and execution. We can see, contemporary examples of this in the United States. I mean, laws against loitering, for example, right? I mean, loitering is basically just hanging out, and oftentimes, it's a racialized form of hanging out. But oftentimes people loiter because they don't have any place else to hang out. Right? So it's treated as their fault that they have to be taking up public space. I mean, not that they shouldn't have the right to take up public space, but they're criminalized for that, right? Rather than asking, well, why is it that the only place to hang out is in front of this store shop? Right? We can think about criminalizing panhandling, laws against homelessness and sleeping on the benches, or, taking the benches and putting those really disgusting, uncomfortable sort of barriers along the bench so that it makes it just terribly uncomfortable to sleep. So this is still going on, right? The criminalization of the unemployed, right? Rather than the criminalization of the system that produces their unemployment. There are three kinds of legislation that discipline wage labor. So one was extending the working day. We saw this in chapter 10. Marx didn't pay a lot of attention to it then, but by extending the working day, it can drive down wages and therefore compel people to work for longer. Driving down wages itself, right? Creating a wage ceiling so that workers have to work more. And of course, outlawing and disciplining unions and coalitions. For the development of capitalism, then, it isn't enough for the objective conditions to change, right? For capital to accumulate at one pole and misery to accumulate at the other. Capitalism had to fade its overt violence into the background and develop a working class which, by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. So this is incredibly crucial because it points to the ways in which capital depends on its superstructural elements, right? It's ideological, it's educational training, it's cultural, suppositions, right? And that the relations of production are both objective and subjective, right? It's the way that things are, but it's also the way that we think that things are, right? And we can see this today with the ideology of meritocracy, that those who work hard get rewarded. And so therefore, if you're not successful, it's because you didn't work hard enough, you made the wrong choices, you pursued the wrong major, whatever. Chapter 29 looks at the genesis of the capitalist farmer. Basically, in England, farmers are serfs who become bailiffs, and then farmers who are basically serfs, except they exploit other wage laborers, right? And then there's sort of half farmers who split capital investment between themselves and the landlord, and then the farmer proper, who makes his own capital breed by employing wage laborers and pays a part of the surplus product and money earned kind to landlord as rent. This positioned them to accumulate capital during the agricultural revolution already described. So this is a process, in other words, of landed property and the forms of labor tied to it being overtaken by capital, right? Capital rather than land. Chapter 30 looks at how the agricultural revolution reacted on industry. So essentially, with the peasantry driven off the land, the raw materials and means of subsistence are commodified, so they're turned into variable capital, right? So the expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the workers, but also their means of subsistence and material for labor. So it also created the home market. It created a group of people, workers, who have to purchase the things that they normally produce themselves under different conditions on the home market. Chapter 31 looks at the genesis of the industrial capitalist. The first thing we must keep in mind, he says, is that revolutions are not made by laws. And we've seen this crop up multiple times throughout the book, particularly in its critiques of Proudhon, that the legal system itself can't be a form of producing revolution. So industrial capital develops out of merchant capital and usurer capital. And merchant capital is the capital of the trader, right? You buy a commodity or a bundle of commodities, and then you export them someplace, you bring them someplace else, and you sell them. Or you buy so many commodities, you can get a deal on them, and then you can take them to the market rather than the producers of the commodities. So you sort of bear some of the risk involved. And then usurer capital is that which is the capital of the lender. So merchant and usurer capital was prevented from turning into industrial capital in the country by the feudal constitution, in the towns by the guild organizations. Industrial capital therefore developed outside of these towns and instead at seaports or at inland ports. And of course, we know that capital is based on growth and expansion. And so it makes sense that the earliest industrial cities would be located by seaports. Also, water was still, right, an important means of energy production. So the formation of industrial capital is also tied up with slavery and colonialism in the United States, the East Indies, and Africa and elsewhere, right? These are the idyllic moments of primitive accumulation. So here the state works together with capital to conquer new markets and colonies, to transform feudalism into capitalism in as quickly as time as possible, to loot resources, to enslave people, to wipe out populations in order to acquire the land and the raw materials, also in order to discipline them into being wage laborers. And so Marx ends right here by saying that force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. So revolutions aren't made by force, revolutions are made by force. They're not made by changes to the legal system. And force, of course, here, Marx doesn't specify exactly what kind of force, right? But, and there's many different kinds of force beyond purely physical force. So the state propels capital by creating public debt, right, or national debt. So this turns money into capital easily. I think Marx calls it like a magic wand, right, because it happens through bonds which function like money, right? So the richer the country, the more debt it has. The only part of the so-called national wealth that actually enters into the collective possessions of modern peoples is their national debt, right? And so we've seen this all the time, which is that the profits are always privately held, but then when it comes time to paying the debt, well, that's something that is socially shared, right? So when the banks collapsed the economy in 2007 and 2008, or really 2009, they themselves didn't make up for any of the debt or the loss that was accrued by the government bailouts. We all did that. Workers paid that. It also creates an international credit debt circle or cycle. So when a production in a country declines or it's outstripped elsewhere, it lends capital. Marx gives two examples. Holland to England, England to the US. So a great deal of capital which appears today in the United States without any certificate of birth was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. And because national debt facilitates the centralization of capital, some mistake it and not capital as the cause of misery. And Marx has a polemic against those that would, say that debt is the problem rather than capital. And there's still contemporary arguments about that, right? that, well, we have to get, I mean, obviously debt is important, but debt arises from, at least debt as we know it today, the way it structures our society today, is a result of capitalism. Capitalism is not the result of debt. And then, of course, because the national debt is increasing, there's an increased need for taxation, which becomes a principle. Each method of primitive accumulation, the colonial system, public debts, taxes, protection, commercial wars, in the manufacture age was exacerbated with modern industry, right? Because the scale of accumulation grew, as we saw in the last class in chapter 25. So we note that while the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, it gave in the United States a stimulus to the transformation of the earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. So again, even though Marx is looking at England, he can't look at the production of capitalism in England and its growth and its history without looking at slavery in the United States, without looking at colonialism in Africa, right? These are all sort of bound up together, but capitalism changes the nature of slavery and of colonialism. And these are the forces that establish the eternal laws of capitalist production, laws that we're, of course, are told are eternal, right? And so then there's the famous quote, if money, according to Auger, comes into the world with a congenital blood stain on one cheek, capital comes dripping from head to foot from every pore with blood and dirt. Now in this chapter, Marx sort of weaves together the historical presentation and the economic arguments outlined in the book so far into one sweeping narrative through the dialectic. Right? And it's short, it's agitational, and I think it's concise, and there's a lot in here, right? So we start with the private property of individual laborers, and this is the basis of petty industry, agriculture or manufacture, right? It also exists under slavery and serfdom, but it attains its adequate classical form only where the laborer is the private owner of his own means of labor set in action by himself, or the peasant of the land which he cultivates. And this is because, as we read in, I think, chapter 10, and maybe it was early, maybe it's chapter 7, when he's talking about, or actually, I'm sorry, maybe it's chapter 3, where he's talking about Aristotle and how Aristotle couldn't see surplus value, right? Because he was living in a slave society, not a society of wage labor. And it brings forth the material agencies for its own dissolution. And that was what chapters 11 through 15 were about, right? And from that moment, new social forces and new passions spring up in the bosom of society, but the old social organization fetters them and keeps them down. It must be annihilated. It is annihilated. And that's what, in many ways, chapter 15 was about. So the annihilation of the private property of the many combines into individual property of the few, right? And the huge individual property of the few. And then capital also expropriates other capitalists through centralization, which we read about in chapter 25. So accompanying centralization is a development of labor as a cooperative social process, right? The application of science to production, creation of means of production to be used in common, the collective labor, and the entanglement of all peoples in the net of the world market, and with this, the international character of the capitalistic regime. So we've gone from the, individual property of the many to the huge property of the few. But there's still a disjunction between the relations of production and social relations. So as capital grows, absolutely, through concentration, and it grows relatively through centralization, so too grows the revolt of the working class, which is always increasing in size, which is increasingly united and organized by the very mechanism of capitalist production itself, because it's capitalism that's creating a common collective worker, that's bringing them together in the factories and together in the cities. So the monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the capitalist mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production reach a point where they become incompatible with the capitalist integument. Thus, integument is burst asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds, the expropriators are expropriated. So, one contradiction to see in this is that between social production and private ownership. Well, everything's being produced socially and on an international character, right? International level. And so there's a contradiction between that and then the profits themselves being owned by individual capitalists and also claimed by individual nation states. Marx makes one last note here, which is that he sees that, he says the capitalist revolution was the expropriation of many by the few. And so there was loads of violence, right? But the socialist revolution entails the expropriation of the few by the many. So there is potentially less violence that might be needed, right? And it's worthwhile noting the end of this chapter in relationship to the end of chapter 10, where Marx was talking about, workers putting their heads together, passing an all-powerful Magna Carta that would limit the normal working day to 10 hours, right? Here he describes the overthrow of the capitalist mode of production as a whole. And so clearly Marx is thinking about reform and revolution not as antagonistic, but as dialectically related, right? Sort of feeding off of each other. And then after this amazing crescendo and conclusion that, sort of makes us want to go into the streets, we get to chapter 33, the last one, the modern theory of colonization. And in particular, it's a extrapolation of Wakefield's theory of colonialism. The key to his discovery, Marx gives him credit for seeing that capital isn't a thing, but a social relation between persons established by the instrumentality of things, right? By divorcing them from the soil and the means of subsistence. So the problem that Wakefield was dealing with was if the laborer can accumulate for himself, as long as he has ownership of the means of production or subsistence, then capitalist accumulation and capitalism are impossible. So colonialism has to produce these relations, right? And the trick is to kill two birds with one stone, let the government put upon the virgin soil an artificial price independent of the law of supply and demand that compels the immigrant to work a long time for wages before he can earn enough money to buy land and turn himself into a peasant. So this is, also about settler colonialism and to prevent, those who are settler colonialists, who are workers, from becoming, from preventing the capitalist mode of production to flourish in the new land, right? And it also shows that really the struggle for land reclamation is central to Marxist theory. It's all about who has access to the land. Not only that, but land, the access to land is a central component of this. And so obviously it's interesting that Marx chooses to end the book here. But the way that I see it is that there's this crescendoing moment where there's the negation of the negation and the social relations become a fetter on the mode of production. The mode of production has to be burst asunder, and it is, right? The expropriators are expropriated, and then he returns to colonization. And I think really, after focusing on the internal dynamics of capitalism, Marx is here gesturing to its outside, right? As capital is value in motion, value that's expanding, it needs to go elsewhere. And as Lenin showed, right, in imperialism, right, this is one way in which capital was able to keep its contradictions at bay for a period of time until they sort of heightened and became shown on a new level, right, expressed on a new level. And because capitalism is a social relation, it's dynamic and it's always changing. So primitive accumulation too is always changing, and it's an ongoing process played out through class struggle, right? So whenever something is made public, that's sort of, you know, a reclamation of capitalist property, right? And then whenever something public is made private, that's an expropriation of the many by the few, right? So because it's depriving us from, you know, sort of more or less open access to the means of subsistence, right? And then it's commodifying it, and then it's making us buy it, right? So education is an example, the privatization of transportation, of even public spaces. And you can think about, hang on, I'm having trouble, eminent domain, right? Which is literally literally like the theft of land, often from, right, small proprietors into as a means of centralizing capital, right? So these things are definitely ongoing. And that's really, that brings us to the end of the book. So in terms of sort of discussing the book overall, let's do that in discussion. And I'm really glad that everybody was able to stick through this. We had really great attendance, a lot of really great engagement. And, you know, I hope now that people feel comfortable, you know, teaching this book to others or talking about it to others. This hasn't been intended as like a comprehensive, the final word on Marxist capital. Obviously, there's so much in here that we didn't get to, but we were just trying to sort of attend to, you know, some of the sort of key points that we as organizers for socialism and liberation would find helpful in our organizing and in our outreach and in our recruitment, in our strategizing, and our tactics. So, so for those of you who have to go, I'll see you later. And please, if you do have any questions, let me know over email.